Hey, this is Dave with Taboo Customs. This video today we're going to take a look at installing a set of MRAP seats in a Jeep Cherokee here. Now, what are MRAP seats? Well, an MRAP is a mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicle that the U.S. military has been using for, I think, about over a decade now. I don't know, I've been out of the military now for over a decade, so it wasn't there when I was there. Pretty much came with the push after 9/11, obviously. And you know, it was really due to needing a vehicle with increased resistance to IEDs to get our soldiers around. So they kept a lot of soldiers safe. Now, if you're watching this video, chances are you might not be particularly interested in the MRAP in the Cherokee, but you're interested in MRAP seats because they are starting to be available now. So first off, I was going to give you some information on the MRAP seats. We've obviously already installed ours in the Cherokee, and the main thing you're obviously looking for at them for probably is that they have integrated harnesses. You know, a 5-point harness with a submarine belt. So a little bit of information on that. You pretty much can't get rid of the submarine belt because the submarine belt actually holds the main latch for all of the belts. One thing we noticed is that when you do let off the lap belts, the lap belts stick out about 10 inches. You know, so with this Jeep here, you know, he's going to have to make sure he keeps it inside the Jeep when he shuts his doors because they do kind of flop outward like that. The rest of it, I mean, the integrated harnesses work well. I mean, these here, I mean, they're basically seatbelt retractors is what it is. You've got 4 seatbelt retractors. You got one here, 2 in the back, and 1 on the other side. So they're pretty cool. Now, as far as the seats themselves, the military, when they buy things, they don't start with comfort at the top, or probably even in the top 5. So they are very hard. They're very durable, but they're not probably the most comfortable things that you'll ride in. In addition to that, they are extremely heavy. As far as the installation, that was probably the biggest thing. Trying to deal with that is that trying to deal with the weight of the seats is pretty crazy. They are extremely heavy. And, you know, we looked at trying to reduce some of the weight, but there's really not much you can do without having to, you know, cut them up. And you don't really want to go and cut up these seats because they are pretty expensive, and you're going to jeopardize some of the design. So in the next part of the video, we'll take a look at some of the understructure of these seats. All right, so look at the bottom of these seats. There's a couple other things to note about MRAP seats. One, they're very heavy. There's a lot of steel in the bottom of these seats. There's this plate here, then there's actually some larger straps. There's a whole steel subframe. You can see the large plates here on the side. Now, I don't know how much of this was to actually protect the troops sitting in the seats. I know the vehicles themselves were heavily armored, and I can't imagine much penetrating that. I know I've seen pictures of the front ends blown out of them. But one thing is the seats are very heavy if you do plan on using them. They do have a adjustable seat slides that we'll be reusing. Now, to start the install, I think what we're going to do is this bottom plate here. If we remove this plate here, we should be able to remove that bottom plate. We can try to fit it up in the Jeep, see where we can fit it, see if we can get it roughly close to where the seat was, the old seat was, and figure out how to mount it. Now, we have sliders on our Jeep that extend all the way to the unibody frame, which has been stiffened. So we're going to be tying into those sliders to make sure, because that's one of the things, since this has an integrated harness, really the safety then is about connecting this seat to the Jeep securely. You know, and that's probably partially why it's so heavy, because, you know, if in a rollover or something like this, this was what was holding the troop in their seat. You know, the seat let go, they're going to go flying around the cab. So let's take this off, and we'll see what we can do with it in the Jeep. Alright, so while we work with these MRAP seats, one thing we wanted to note if you are looking to install MRAP seats and anything is we ran into some issues with the seat slider bolts. So these are actually the bolts that go from that plate we've been using to create our mounting up through. They go through the bottom of that plate and their countersunk bolts into the seat bracket here, and this is actually the nut that goes inside the seat slider. Well, to make this nut tight enough so it kind of stay in there so they gotta tighten a bolt down, they added this little piece here. However, we noticed, and it looks like it's also a lock washer, it's kind of coned here, so as you tighten it down it'd lock. But one thing we noticed is this will pop up and actually spin, because this nut itself can spin inside the seat track. So it has to be down inside this thing, and even if it's down inside this thing, we actually had one that spun anyway. So what we did is we ended up taking a small screwdriver and sliding down the seat track and stuck it in between the wall. But if you are installing MRAP seats, watch out for these. The other thing we had is that once you take them out, they can slide down inside the seat track, so you don't want them to slide down the seat track, so try to grab them before they do. Okay, so as you can see, we went ahead and we threw the passenger seat up in here, and the reason for that is I really kind of wanted to see how it fit as it is, and that side is not as critical as the driver's side, so that's why I took the plate off the bottom of this side. We'll use that side to kind of see how it fits. Now obviously with this Jeep here, this is our Green XJ project, so we're running a Dana 300 and we're actually running that as a passenger side drop, so it's different from the original Cherokee where it was a driver's side drop. So there's an extra hump right here that sticks out that wasn't over there, but now we've actually got a cutout in the floor over there that the transfer case sticks through. And one thing we're finding is that we're going to have to clearance some of this plate to be able to clear that transfer case and to build another cover over that. And I'll show you that in a minute. But first we're going to talk about the driver's side here. Now on the driver's side, you know, one of the critical things is going to be wanting to get the seat lined up with the steering wheel. You know, we could fit this plate over here, but that's not going to work for us. So we marked the center of the plate where the center of the seat is. We took a plumb bob and marked here on the floor where the center of the steering wheel is. And now in lining these up and looking at it, you notice obviously we hit this tunnel here, which would be a pretty big problem. You know, we could probably clearance it some, but I don't know how much clearance we would have with the original transfer case in there. Now with this one though, we don't have a transfer case on this side anymore, so we can go ahead and make some clearance. Now, based on the passenger side, we've already seen that the rear of the seat's pretty much going to be, this bracket is going to be on the floor or close to it, and the front of the bracket's up about 3-4 inches off the floor of the Jeep. So the good news is that helps with the clearance, not only on this side but also on that side, because we got to clear that transfer case. So we look pretty good here. Now we can start figuring out, okay, how do we want to do our brackets? Now before we start talking about the brackets, let's take a quick look at what I was talking about on this passenger side. And you can see the bracket on the bottom comes into contact with the transfer case. Now the good news is there's 3 holes in this bracket, so I don't really have a problem with going in, cutting the corner of this bracket off. You know, and being that the passenger side, I don't have to worry too much about any kind of alignment. We do have to make sure it fits in. Now one thing with these seats though, they just barely fit in. You can see the seatbelt retractor there is pretty tight. And also, you know, we do have a little bit of room over to the middle of the Jeep, so we can move these over a little bit. We probably will do that once we clearance for that transfer case. Okay, so we figured out our mounting system for our driver's side now, and one thing we noticed is that as we sat in the passenger seat, we felt like it was a little bit too high. And I'm 6 foot, and I know the owner of this Jeep is taller than I am, and you know, that was a little bit too high, I think, for him. Obviously, the passenger seat we can treat a little bit differently than the driver's seat. He's going to be sitting in this seat a lot, so I wanted to move it down. So I ended up having to make some changes in it to move it down. But first, let's talk about our mounting process. So the first thing I wanted to do is make a solid base. So looking at the floor, I said, okay, I can make a pretty well flat sheet here on the floor, and we wanted to tie this into our sliders underneath the Jeep. Now, if you haven't seen our sliders, we have a video on our sliders. We have very substantial sliders with 2 by 2 inch tube running over to a reinforced unibody frame. So it's very substantial, strong enough to mount a roll cage off of, and strong enough to mount these seat brackets off of. So what we did is we created a couple of square holes here where we're going to run tubes down through the seat mounting plate to the sliders, and then weld those tubes to the sliders. That way we can tie this plate into the sliders. In addition to that, we added 3 holes over here that are just on the other side of the unibody frame on the inside, so that we can bolt that to the inside. For a couple of reasons. One, it gives us a good place to use as a datum as we're building this, but it also reinforces this side because the seat bracket is going to be skewed towards the inside. So now, as for the seat bracket itself, in the front, we've got a couple of brackets that we actually had in stock that we're going to use for mounting. And one of the things we're going to do is we're actually going to put that in front of this plate, because there's a little dip down here, and that'll allow us to weld on the top and the bottom and make those really strong. Then, as I said, we wanted to drop the seat bracket down some, so we actually dropped it down about 1.5 inches. Now, when we did that, we had to do a lot of modification to this, a lot more hammering than we did earlier to basically get this clear of this bracket. We've got it there now. We also had to do a couple other things to this seat bracket itself. One, we added a hole here in the center because this hole was off, and then we also cut this rear flange off, because when we dropped this down, the seat was pretty much going to be sitting flat, and it really didn't do a whole lot for the back of the seat as far as dropping it down. So I wanted to drop the back of the seat down as well, and so we cut that bracket off. We're going to bolt directly through this this bracket and through the floor and into our bolts underneath. Now, we also had to make some modifications on the inside, or excuse me, on the bottom side of this bracket. You can see these flanges here. Now, what this was is there was a oh shit bracket underneath this seat. That's what this bracket here, what it's for is if these 4 bolts break here, this is a secondary bracket to keep that seat from coming off of this base, because there's really only 4 grade 8 5/16 bolts holding the sliders to this bracket. Now, because we moved this down so far to the floor, we had to cut these flanges off, and then we'll also have to take this this bracket here, cut it down shorter, and weld a new plate across it just to make sure we got enough clearance. Now, we debated whether we wanted to use the plate or not, and we do want to use the plate, you know, and I'm going to make sure this is as safe as possible, so we're going to rebuild that bracket. Now, the next step is going to be taking this bracket, bolting it up here, and starting to, you know, figure out where these 2 brackets up front are going to go, and then get our tubes installed here so that we can weld everything up, get everything painted underneath this, and then we'll take some seam sealer and we'll seal this to the floor as we put it on here and weld it to our sliders. Alright, so our next steps here is going to be installing our tubes, and what we're going to do on this back one, we're going to install this one flush, because whenever the seat bracket sits back here, it actually sits across the top of that tube, but we'll be able to weld on the top and the bottom of this plate, so it'll be strong. This one here up front will actually be able to leave up a little bit, so we'll actually flush it up to the bottom of the tube for the slider. Then we're going to mount our seat bracket, get this bracket in place. This one we aren't going to be able to reach with our welder with it in the Jeep. So we're actually going to have to remove it, take it to our bench and weld it up. And at that time we'll also weld up this whole thing solid. We'll paint it up, and then we can come back, reinstall it, weld it to our sliders, and install our seat bracket. Alright, so on our passenger side here, we've done the similar mount to our driver's side. We did have to extend it a little bit longer. Our tube back here is a little bit different location. And the mount fits pretty well. Now we just need to go in, drill our 3 holes, and cut our 2 holes for our tubes. And what I did to find my tubes is, I felt underneath and I actually drilled a hole right along the edge of the tube. So basically I could find where I needed to put those square holes in my plate. Alright, so now that we've got the plate installed, we can go ahead and measure and then cut and weld up the ends on our tubes, and it'll go down. And then we'll actually bring our seat back over, because the issue we have with this is that we need this seat as far over to the passenger side as possible to give us room to make our cover for this transfer case. And the more room we can get, the better, because as this transfer case will move a little bit as we are wheeling the Jeep. Alright, so let's get making our tubes. Alright, so you can see the floor a little bit closer now and how we did that. The holes here that we've cut that our tubes will go through. And now we'll grab our bracket. You can see on our bracket, we went in, we gusseted both the front and the rear mounts to make sure they're strong. And here's where we'll bolt through the floor and then weld these in. But before we do that, we are going to seal around these areas here just with some seam sealant, and just to make sure that exhaust and water doesn't come up through them. Then for bolting them, we're using all grade 8 bolts. Anywhere we're bolting anything, we use grade 8 bolts, and then we will use nylock nuts underneath because we want to make sure that they don't come loose. Now on the bottom, we're going to use fender washers, fairly heavy fender washers. That way we can make sure that there's no risk to those pulling through. But honestly, with welding it to the sliders here, it's really just a secondary precaution. Alright, so now we can go underneath and weld up our tubes. Okay, so before we weld these up, we'll show you what we're talking about when we're talking about these tubes that are coming out here, our slider tubes. You'll see that we'll be able to weld down both sides of this tube and then across the bottom on both the front and the rear to really make sure that that plate is tied in. It's not going to go anywhere, even if they were to roll the Jeep over. Now I won't be able to show you this while I'm welding because I've already gotten in trouble for getting spatter on one camera, and don't really have a good place to put the camera, so I'll just have to get it welded up off camera. Okay, so now we've got this welded. Pretty much we've got our bracket now installed. We got to do some painting and some touch-up. So what's left is really just bolting the seat up. Now for bolting the seat up, we are using, again, like I said, grade 8 7/16 bolts. Now for this one, because on the passenger side here in our Cherokee, we're still having to make a cover right here, we're just going to loosely bolt it in. And that way we can see what kind of clearances we need for our cover. So that does it for our install into the Cherokee. Let me tell you, this was some of the most difficult seats that I've had to install into a Cherokee. And if I was running a Cherokee with a standard driver's side drop transfer case, I don't think I would have really been able to install them. If I did, I would have had to install them taller, higher up, like the passenger seat. And honestly, for a guy like me, it's a little bit too tall. So I'm really glad that we're running a passenger side drop. In this case, we're able to drop this down. Now with the drop down, they do fit pretty well, but it was a very difficult install. One with the weight and just trying to create a bracket to match up to the seats themselves, and then actually wrestling the seats in was really a pain in the butt. So if you have any questions on MRAP seats or the install into a Cherokee, you can get a hold of us at taboocustoms.com, or if you're interested in any of our products, we have a store there on our website that you can visit. So be sure to visit us, and thanks for watching.